room wasn't just quiet. It felt tense, like something was about to break. Cameras were locked in, not just recording, but hunting for something real, something that didn't match the image people had believed in for years. And right in the middle of it all, he sat there, still, controlled, almost too controlled. No visible panic, no clear emotion, just a face that refused to give anything away. But that was the problem, because the more he stayed calm, the more it started to feel unnatural. Like this wasn't just a man on trial, it was a performance under pressure. For decades, people thought they knew exactly who he was, the charming outsider, the unpredictable genius, the man who never played by the rules but somehow always stayed in control. But now, that same unpredictability was being pulled apart, examined, questioned in ways it never had been before. Details started coming out, then more, and none of them seemed to fully align. Some made him look like a victim. Others suggested something far more complicated. And the deeper people looked, the harder it became to hold on to the version of him they once trusted. Because this wasn't just about what happened behind closed doors, it was about whether the man everyone believed in had ever really existed at all. And once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave. Johnny Depp was never supposed to fit the system, and that was exactly why people trusted him. He wasn't the clean-cut Hollywood lead, he wasn't predictable, and he didn't look like someone trying to be liked. Instead, he built his identity on being different, on playing characters that felt broken, strange, and completely out of place. And somehow, that turned into power. From Edward Scissorhands to Captain Jack Sparrow, he didn't just act, he disappeared. And audiences didn't just watch him, they believed him. He became the symbol of authenticity in an industry built on illusion. The guy who looked like he couldn't be controlled and therefore must be real. That image didn't just sell movies, it built trust. People weren't just fans, they were convinced they understood him. But that belief came with a blind spot. Because the more consistent the image felt, the less anyone questioned it. The chaos looked intentional, the unpredictability looked artistic, and everything that didn't quite make sense was dismissed as part of the persona. For years, nothing broke that illusion. Not the rumors, not the whispers, not the small inconsistencies that didn't quite fit. Because once people decide who you are, they stop looking for anything that says otherwise. And that's where the problem begins. Because when the image finally starts to crack, it doesn't break slowly. It collapses all at once. But that's only part of the story. Long before everything exploded, there were signs. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to feel slightly wrong if you looked close enough. On set, things didn't always run smoothly. There were reports of delays, misschedules, moments where he simply wasn't where he was supposed to be. At first, it didn't matter. This was Hollywood, and he was Johnny Depp. Talent covers a lot of problems. Success makes people look the other way. But when the same stories start repeating, they stop sounding like accidents. They start sounding like patterns, and patterns are harder to ignore. There were also whispers about money. Not a lack of it, but the way it was being handled. Massive earnings, yet growing financial pressure. Spending that didn't match stability. Decisions that didn't look calculated. They looked impulsive. Again, nothing shocking on its own, but put together, it painted a picture that didn't quite align with the idea of someone fully in control. And that's where things start to shift. Because the version of Depp people believed in was precise, intentional, even in his chaos. But this felt different. This felt like the chaos wasn't being managed anymore. It was starting to leak into real life. Some people close to him reportedly saw it earlier than the public did. Subtle changes in behavior and consistency and how he showed up, not just as an actor, but as a person. And when those small changes begin, they don't stay small for long. They build, quietly, until one day they're impossible to contain. And by the time the public starts paying attention, the situation is already far more complicated than it appears. Then everything stopped being quiet. What had been rumors, patterns, and small inconsistencies suddenly turned into something impossible to ignore. His relationship with Amber Heard didn't just fall apart, it detonated in public. Allegations surfaced, serious ones, and they didn't stay contained for long. They spread fast across headlines, across platforms, across an audience that had never seen him in this position before. And almost immediately, the narrative split. On one side, there was the image people had trusted for decades. On the other, there were claims that challenged that image at its core. Then came the responses, the denials, the counterclaims, each one adding another layer, each one making the situation harder to define. But what made this different wasn't just the accusations, it was the exposure. Private arguments became public evidence, audio recordings were released, messages were dissected, courtrooms turned into stages, and millions of people were watching in real time, not as a distant audience, but as participants forming opinions as the story unfolded. And the more information came out, the less stable everything felt, because nothing landed cleanly. Some details seemed to support one side, then others pulled it in the opposite direction. It wasn't a clear narrative, it was a collision of perspectives. And that's when the real shift happened, because for the first time, people weren't just asking what happened, they were questioning who he actually was. And once that question takes hold, it changes everything that comes after. At this point, it stopped being just about a relationship and started becoming something much harder to untangle. Because when you strip away the headlines, what you're left with is a man who had been living inside a carefully constructed identity for decades. Not just an actor playing roles, but someone who blurred the line between performance and reality so well that even the audience stopped seeing the difference. And that kind of life comes with pressure most people never experience. Fame at that level doesn't just amplify success, it amplifies everything. Every habit, every flaw, every moment of instability gets stretched, repeated, and eventually normalized. According to some reports, there had been struggles behind the scenes for years. Issues that didn't fit the public narrative, but were never fully visible either. Substance use, emotional volatility, periods of detachment, none of it confirmed in a single clean story, but enough fragments to suggest something deeper was happening. And when you place that inside an industry like Hollywood, it becomes even more complicated. Because the system doesn't correct instability, it often protects it, as long as the results keep coming. As long as the image holds, the machine keeps moving. But once the cracks become visible, that same system can turn just as quickly, and suddenly the person who was once protected is left exposed, isolated but still under constant observation. And that's where things become difficult to define. Because what people were watching wasn't just a public figure under pressure, it was someone whose identity had been shaped, reinforced, and possibly distorted by decades of expectation. And when that kind of identity starts to break down, it doesn't happen cleanly. It happens in fragments, contradictions, moments that don't quite line up. And the more you try to understand it, the more it feels like you're missing something just out of reach. And this is where everything started to spiral. What was once a complicated situation turned into something relentless, something that didn't slow down, didn't give space, didn't allow anything to settle. Every new detail triggered another reaction, another wave of analysis, another round of people choosing sides with even more certainty than before. The story wasn't just unfolding, it was accelerating. Online, it became something else entirely. Not just discussion, but momentum. Clips were shared. Moments were isolated. Expressions were interpreted over and over again until they started to mean whatever people wanted them to mean. And once that happens, the story stops being controlled by facts alone. It becomes shaped by perception, by repetition, by which version spreads faster. At the same time, the consequences were no longer abstract. They were visible. Projects disappeared. Partnerships shifted. The industry that once relied on him began to step back. Not necessarily with clear statements, but with quiet decisions that spoke just as loudly. And that silence carried weight, because in Hollywood, distance is rarely accidental. But what made this phase different wasn't just the external fallout. It was the instability of the narrative itself. It kept changing. One moment it leaned in one direction, the next it pulled back. Support surged, then doubt followed. And the more it moved, the harder it became to hold on to any single version of the truth, because there wasn't one. There were multiple, overlapping, conflicting versions, all existing at the same time. And in the middle of that, the person at the center of it all became harder to define than ever. Not because there wasn't enough information, but because there was too much of it, and none of it fit together cleanly. This is the part where the story stops being comfortable, because no matter how much information is presented, it never fully settles into one clear conclusion. According to some sources, Depp was placed in a situation that escalated beyond control, a conflict that became public in ways neither side could fully manage. Others argue that what surfaced wasn't sudden at all, but a reflection of patterns that had been building long before anyone was paying attention. And that's where the tension sits, right in the middle of those two interpretations. Evidence was shown, but interpretation became everything. The same clip could be seen as proof by one group and dismissed by another. Testimonies carried weight, but that weight shifted depending on who was listening. And once perception splits like that, it doesn't come back together easily. There's no single narrative that dominates, no version that feels complete enough to close the case in the public mind. Some details seem to align, others create more doubt. And even now, there are parts of the story that remain unclear. Not because they are hidden, but because they don't fit neatly into a single explanation. There is no confirmed evidence that fully defines one side as entirely right or entirely wrong in the eyes of the public. And that uncertainty is what keeps the story alive. Because people don't just want answers, they want clarity. And this is a situation that refuses to give it. It forces a more uncomfortable realization that sometimes what we're looking at isn't a story with a resolution, but a conflict where the full truth exists somewhere between perspectives, just out of reach. In the end, this story doesn't resolve the way people expect it to. There's no clean answer, no single version that explains everything without leaving something out. And maybe that's the point. Because what the situation exposed wasn't just a series of events, it exposed how fragile public perception really is. For years, Johnny Depp represented something clear, something people felt confident believing in, an image that seemed consistent, controlled, even when it appeared chaotic on the surface. But once that image was questioned, it didn't just crack, it split into multiple versions, each one convincing in its own way. And the uncomfortable part is realizing that both of those versions can exist at the same time, not because one is true and the other's false, but because reality is rarely that simple. People are layered, situations are complex, and when those layers are pulled into the public eye, they don't form a clean narrative. They collide. And what's left is something harder to process. Not certainty, but ambiguity. Not closure, but tension that doesn't fully disappear. Maybe the truth isn't something that was hidden. Maybe it's something that was always there, just seen differently depending on where you were looking. And that leaves one final question. Not about what happened, but about what people choose to believe after everything they've seen. Because once that belief shifts, it doesn't go back to what it was before. And maybe that's why stories like this don't really end. They just stay with you, sitting somewhere in the back of your mind, unfinished, unresolved. Because the more you look at them, the more questions they leave behind. If this story made you pause, if it made you question what you thought you understood, then there's more to explore. Not just about this, but about the people, the moments, and the narratives that never feel as simple as they first appear. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into stories like this, where the surface is only the beginning.